I'd like to introduce Lewis Wilson, researcher from CSIRO and CRC, based at ACRI, and has a lot of previous research experience with host transmission of cotton Bunchytop. Hey Lewis. Lewis, aphids are a known vector of cotton Bunchytop. What do you see as the main issue in their control?
So I think there's two issues. One is we're trying to manage aphids as a vector of the disease. Secondly, we're trying to manage them as a pest in terms of yield loss and honeydew. So there's two issues there. One is reducing the risk from them in the first place, and the second is dealing with them once you've got them.
What options do growers have to manage their aphid and Bunchytop vector?
I think there's two main strategies there. The first is to reduce the risk overall. So that means reducing the hosts on the farm for the aphids to survive from one winter to the next one summer to the next. Over winter, they don't have a diet pause form, they need food in the form of host plants. So if you reduce the number of host plants, particularly volunteers and returns of cotton, but also other broadleaf weeds, you'll reduce that risk.
If despite overwinter control of aphid hosts, there are aphids in the crop early, what should the grower consider?
I think what the grower should consider is establishing just how much of a problem they're likely to have. So that means good sampling of the field to get an idea of the distribution of aphids and how many they've got. Secondly, establishing that the aphids are cotton aphids, because you'll get a lot of aphids coming off other hosts that will be looking for something to feed on but won't establish on cotton. They'll settle and test feed and leave. So if all you've got is winged aphids, that probably means it's not cotton aphid. But if you find that you've got young aphids, so the aphids are reproducing, it probably is cotton aphid. And then the third thing I think is to get some idea of how much mortality there is with the aphids. So what you could do there is find some areas where the aphids are more abundant and actually mark them with a fiberglass pole. Come back to those spots later on and have a look. You know, if you went there last week and the aphids were confined to one plant, come back this week and they're gone entirely, that tells you there's a reasonable amount of mortality. But if you come back a week later and they've spread to 2 more plants and they're obviously doing very well, that tells you that there's not much mortality and the aphids are going well. And that will then affect whether you decide you might want to control them or whether you think there's enough natural mortality occurring.
As aphids have resistance and potential resistance to chemical control, should growers be planning an approach now to chemical aphid control?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So in the early 2000s, Grant Heron showed that there was resistance in aphids to pyrimecarb, which is a carbamate, and the organophosphates, dimethoate and amethylate. Now we've lost that resistance and we'd like to keep it that way. We don't want to reselect that resistance. However, since then, Grant's shown that we've now got resistance to the neonicotinoids. So that's things like Shield, Actara, Intruder, Confidor, that class of chemistry. So what that means now, and at the same time, we've lost endosulfan. So we've got resistance to, we've got the threat of resistance to a group that we've depended on in the past. We've got resistance to the neonicotinoids, and we've lost endo, which was an alternative control agent. So what that means is growers really do need to plan ahead so that they can use the limited options they've got very effectively without selecting for resistance again, or finding that they can't control the aphids because of cost or because they've run out of options that will work. So I think that at this time of the year now, looking ahead and thinking, well, if I've got aphids on my seedling cotton and I sampled and I decide I need to control them, what would be my first option? If the aphids didn't turn up till later, what would be my strategy there? That sort of planning now will really help.
Okay. What will increase your chances of having a cotton Bunchytop problem?
I think the factors that will increase that are, one, you had a problem last year, because that means that the disease is obviously in that area in the vicinity, and two, having hosts for it. So having it last year and having lots of hosts for it through winter increases the risks. And so the hosts could be cotton volunteers and ratoons, but also potentially some of the broadleaf weeds. We know marshmallow is a host, but other weeds could be a host as well.
Okay. Marshmallow has been positively identified as a host for aphids and Bunchytop. Are there any other weeds apart from cotton that could also fit this category?
So the answer to that question is we don't know, but we suspect that there probably is. In the 98 season, when we had the first big outbreak of Bunchytop, we didn't have the numbers of volunteers and ratoons on farms that we have now. So that big aphid outbreak most likely came from some other source. So was it marshmallow? It could have been. That weed was quite abundant that year. It's a host for the disease and a host for aphids. But there's probably other malvaceous weeds or indeed other weed species that could be hosts for Bunchytop as well. So we've now got a tool or a test which we can use to establish if a plant has Bunchytop. And so we'll be working with Murray Sharman and Cherie Gamberley to look at a range of those weeds to see if we can establish if they have Bunchytop in them or not, and that'll give us a better picture as to where that disease is in the environment.
Even if a grower does do all the right things to minimise their greenbridge, are they still at risk from outside sources?
I think that's a really good point. If you keep your farm very clean, but the farm next door is very dirty with lots of volunteers and weeds, the aphids aren't going to know they're supposed to stay there. They'll move around. So really, if you want to be effective, it really needs a more of an area-wide or community approach to the problem. So, I think in areas particularly that were burnt last year a bit with Bunchytop, they really need to work together to reduce hosts for that disease as far as they can in that area, so that they get the overall benefit rather than one grower suffering because his neighbour did the wrong thing.
How long does the disease stay in aphid? A day or two, or their whole life?
It's another very good question. We don't really know the full answer to that question. We do know that the disease will stay in aphids for at least a week. So if you get an affected aphid, put it into a plant, let it feed, then move it to a new plant the next day, it'll infect that plant as well. And we've done that up to 7 days. So we know it's persistent in aphids for at least a week. That means it's likely to be persistent for even longer. So, which could mean that aphids that survive through sections of the winter are potentially still going to be carrying the disease.
Thanks, Thomas.
Cheers.